So in order for you to relate to anybody else, relationship-wise, will require you to leave some space in your mind, in your heart, in your rage, in your sorrow, in your grief for somebody else.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Food Matters podcast, your home for nutrition, health, and wellness education. My name is Laurentine. I am a filmmaker and a nutritionist and the founder of foodmatters.com, and I'm here to hold your hand on this journey to optimum health, transformation, and emotional healing. Hello, Food Matters community. How is everyone doing? I am amazing. Today, I am joined with a beautiful speaker here in Sydney, actually. She also lives in Sydney. We're both in Sydney today. And her name is Yemi Penn. And she has a beautiful background. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about her background, and then we'll get into some questions with her. So Yemi Penn is an author, documentary producer, and speaker, and Yemi's life work is to raise awareness on the healing of our individual and therefore our collective trauma. We've seen a lot of awareness around trauma, and especially through our documentary series Transcendence, if you've watched that before, either on Gaia or on Food Matters. So you might be familiar with this work. And with this awareness, there's hopefully a realization that there's more work to be done, and we can actually break the cycle of this trauma. So that is what we're going to be talking about today. Yemi, welcome to the studio. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me. And I love how everything's connected because food matters. And then there's this work you're doing where we talk about the other parts of us that matter as well. So yeah, really glad to be here.
That is so true. It's a full wholeness, isn't it?
Correct.
It's a
Yes.
whole human being.
Yes, absolutely.
So for those that don't know your work yet, we'd love to learn a little bit more about where you're from and your story that allowed you to continue your work in trauma.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, the best way I could summarize it is I'm from everywhere. I'm a British-born Nigerian, now living in Sydney, about to go hybrid with America. So all of that, if you can try and place me geographically and where I am, it's going to be tough. I'm currently sitting on Camaragal land in Sydney, Australia. And it's interesting because in order for me to talk about the work I do today, it's important for me to talk about the work I used to do before. So I'm an engineer by profession. I'm a mechanical engineer. It's what really made me move to Australia 10 years ago from the UK, having lived in Japan. I love engineering because engineering for me is a true form of transformation. We have an idea to build a railway, and then you get some people who design it. They find money and then they build it and it happens. But what became really apparent to me a couple of years ago, about half a decade ago, was I thought I was in the business of engineering. It turns out I'm in the business of people. I'm in the business of transforming people. It's the people that need to be transformed in order to get any of the outcomes they want. But in exploring and being curious about my own self as a person, I realized that the dominant story that seemed to have tentacles in all areas of my life was what I would then call unresolved trauma. My own experience of a distressing event that would have happened at a young age. I mean, I think we have more than one, but I just got really curious about it. I wrote my book. And when I did my book launches, it was the chapter on childhood trauma that most people gravitated towards. And I thought, oh, we just don't seem to be talking about this at the level I think we could to heal it. I've never really sat in a victim story. I appreciate the need for the term, but it's also confusing because from what I understand, I think victim comes from is part of a Latin word that can also mean victor, but we focus on the negative more than the positive. And so I was really interested in what's the transformation we can get from a negative experience. And I guess my curiosity and exploration really went deep as I started to do more work on myself, started to do coaching, and then started to make documentaries. And now I'm in my final year of my PhD, where I'm looking at the transformation of cultural trauma through the process of making a documentary with a decolonized lens.
Wow, girl. I love that story. It's very similar to how we got into documentary filmmaking,
Oh,
There is a reason for why
yes,
we want to get it out to, because sometimes we talk about it on a book, but
yeah,
that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's going to read it. But
correct.
being able to get people on the screen, on the TV screen, or on the cinemas, and being able to walk around the world with that in your back pocket saying, just watch this, is beautiful. So, yeah, tell us a little bit more. I'd love to hear more about the documentary as well, but I'd like to go back deeper into, I guess we all want to hear the story of the experience of growing up in cultural trauma and what that was like, and what we can all learn from these experiences.
Oh, the cult, you see, and I mentioned, so trauma simply can be defined as a distressing or disturbing event. And so when you put that, I mean, when I was practicing for my TED talk about 4 years ago, my son then would have been about 6 or 7 years old. And whenever my line would start with, my trauma is bigger than yours. If you listen on, that's not the point I'm trying to make, but it feels like that's the way we are relating to trauma in the world. And my son would come up and say, no, my trauma is bigger than yours. I fell in the playground today. And even though I could laugh, it was the fact that this dude really thought he had a story, and to him, he did. So I say that to say that we all have different forms, and this isn't to lord over it. And cultural trauma is one for me in Australia, particularly. It's around my race and the perceived look of being black, but actually, according to the color spectrum, I'm brown. So it gets also really confusing because it's a construct that we've created. What am I even fighting for? What is the trauma if I'm making reference to being black and then there's white and there's people of color? It's something that I'm really intrigued in us all dissecting just a little bit more. So that's the part of my cultural trauma. But the trauma that I really think has been the catalyst for actually getting into the space of work was me as a child and the maternal uncle abusing his power. So he abused his sexual power over me. And I'm still working on this today, 4 decades on. I'm still unraveling what got locked or silenced in me as a kid that continues to manifest in different areas of my life as I've grown through the different stages. And that really has been the big catalyst for me being a speaker. It's been a big catalyst for me writing my book. And then the documentary that I have to be honest with you, Laurentine, was so left field because on paper, this engineer had no business making a documentary. But like you said, it was creating a different medium, especially because during 2020, my first documentary that I made, our attention span was dwindling faster than ever. The data was showing that we were struggling to take in content for longer than 60 seconds because all of a sudden we were all relying on virtual modes of information. And yeah, so even though there's the cultural trauma, this is more about me wanting to influence where we're going as a world today. But what happened to me at 7 years old is definitely the catalyst for me doing the work I'm doing now.
Oh, amazing, amazing. So, I mean, we all go through different types of trauma, and we all go through, like you're saying, one person's trauma is not as severe as the other person's trauma, but they may actually perceive it like that because in our
Correct.
body, we don't know the difference.
Correct.
And I love talking about this because so many of us, yes, there's the way in is through food and doing detoxes and helping us to cleanse our body. And when we are suffering, when we have an illness or we've been diagnosed with something that is beyond our control, yes, we start with things that we can control. But then
Mm,
sometimes we find out that there's actually more things that we have experienced in our lifetime or in our childhood, even in the womb that we
mm,
have no control over, that we never had control over as children, that can still be affecting us in our future, and that can actually be turning into a predisposition for an illness. So,
yes.
can you explain a little bit about trauma and what, in the context of what you've gone through, and how we can then understand how that can then relate to the predisposition of an illness?
Mm, great question. So even though I've just described trauma as a distressing or disturbing event, those words can seem weightless. So another way that I love talking about it that I continue to find as I explore my research is trauma is anything that happens to us that takes us outside of our window of tolerance.
Mm.
Meaning that if we just, just picture a window, we all have it different sizes. And the theory is for balance, for you to be as balanced, happy, just okay with life, not overjoyed, not underjoyed, but just balanced would require you to stay within this window, whatever the size is. When something traumatic happens, it takes us outside of it. For some people, it takes us under, which can make us kind of be, what's the word, hyper aroused. So for some people, when something traumatic happens, they could shut down, they could be quiet, they are never seen, they appear to not even be heard. And then you've got some people the opposite. They can come outside of the window, but they're at the top of the window and they're hyper aroused. They are the person that is extremely overly sensitive, agitated, anxious. Depression could be the other end. So you've got this window, but depending on your, and I don't want to just say DNA because I do think genetics has something to do with it, but depending on your makeup determines where outside that window you fall when that traumatic event happens. Now, that event can do that, but for a lot of people, they stay stuck outside the window or they are on the periphery of the window, meaning that whenever they are triggered, what happens is they go back outside. And I love that definition of trauma for people to know because just as I explained those two extremes of whether you be in hypo and you kind of like freeze or don't really show up as your full self, or the opposite where you could be aggressive or anxious, that is actually how it can show up as illness. I'm heading off to the States end of this month as it's mental health month. And a lot of it is to talk about that. It's to show what it could look like in you and how it manifests. So for me, an example is if I felt like I had been traumatized, which I had been by what my uncle had done to me, how it starts to manifest, even though I thought I was still in the window, is my apprehension for every man I was to have a physical relationship with. Now, that doesn't necessarily equate immediately to an illness, but what it can do is some of the mental health issues and illnesses that I would have attached to that, which is either constantly being anxious. For me, I go the opposite side. I can get quite aggressive in how I speak to people. So, in some instances, making my current partner pay for the sins of a past partner. That's one way in which it can manifest.
Wow, right. Okay. So if you could talk through all the different ways that these sort of traumas could manifest in regards to beliefs, in regards to emotions, that would be really interesting. So that if we were listening to this and we're going, I think I might be doing that, that might be a way for you, a way in for you to look at, that might,
Yeah.
we need to
So
get.
I love that you made touch on beliefs because beliefs can be formed in many different ways. A lot has to do with our environment. But how, and just to help people who maybe are still trying to unpack it, and this is the great start of what I call cleaning our trauma. And you made mention of cleansing our bodies when we want to detox. I talk about cleaning our trauma. It can be cleansing our trauma. It's actually going in and doing a form of detox of the events that impacted us so that the strategies we used to stay alive in those traumatic incidences are not the ones that are keeping us from living. I will come back to that in a bit. So, how the beliefs can get formed. I just want to share this for people who like the cerebral part. They want to know exactly by steps, as you put. What happens is the experience happens to you, because that's another thing. Trauma tends to be the experience. Sometimes it's rarely the actual event. It's actually how you, as the individual, experienced what happened. I and the person next to me could have gone through the exact same thing, but how we experience it is different. So, what happens is the experience happens. And from that experience, because you've been taken out of your window of tolerance, whether it was at the top or the bottom or even the sides, you have that experience. Now, what happens is you focused your attention on what happened in that moment. So let me give another example. You're in a car, and unfortunately, a car bangs into you. Your whole body is shocked. Maybe, unfortunately, someone had a really bad injury else in the car, or sadly, someone passed away. The experience is the shock in your body. Now, depending on who you are and the circumstance, your body will respond in a certain way. It could either freeze or it could run, could have added to the traumatic event that happened. You are going to focus your attention on how your body responded. From that, you are going to create a theory. that whenever you hear this bang, this loud noise, or you're driving and you see this car get incredibly close to you, your body is going to want to protect you and it's going to freeze or do whatever it did in that incident that happened, I don't know, a year ago, 5 years ago. From that theory, you're going to start to make judgments. You're going
Mhm.
to make a judgment that if anyone is driving like a dickhead, as you might call them, or a muppet, or whatever choice of words you use, you are going to believe that. It becomes a belief because it has been stacked up by that experience that, by the way, you believe is reality because it happened to you. And I want to say, I hear you. It is reality, but it's only one part of reality. And most of us are making beliefs on a small fraction of reality. And on top of that, it's our body that is holding that information. And the work to be done to unpack it is a lot to give you the freedom so that you're not always on edge whenever another car comes close. Did I'm hoping that that came through.
Beautiful. Well, for sure. And it's the triggers, right, that we speak
Yeah.
about. When
Yeah.
these things happen, it's a neural programming that we in our brain go, okay, XYZ equals XYZ. And so if we have associated that, this triggers can be and it can be very daunting. And it might not even be the truth or the reality.
Right. Correct. Exactly that. And there's something you said, it might not be the truth or the reality. I'd say it's not the full truth. I mean, we need to redefine what we think truth is. My truth can be very different to yours. But the point is, especially when we look at the biodiversity of the world, of our planet, we all have different truths. And we're just going to have to figure out as a collective what the total truth is. But for now, if we could humor ourselves, suspend disbelief, and one way in which I believe we can heal our trauma is to say that that was one part of a full truth. And so there are so many other possibilities. And that's the part I love people to tap into.
Mm. Okay, let's delve deeper into how we can break the cycle of the pain that we feel from this trauma. So,
Mm,
let's say for an example, if we had this car accident that you were referring to, and now you are cautious and you don't want to drive in traffic, and especially when you see that XYZ car, you get worried. How do
mm.
we break this pain in our body? How do we turn this around? And what is the strategy that you've come across that works the best?
The first step is acknowledging. You asked that great question of, what are the steps that, trauma could maybe become, something that eventually turns into a belief for someone. Is acknowledging. People really underestimate the power of acknowledging. I had a brilliant coach once that said to me, you cannot say goodbye to something you will not say hello to. Like just in the physics of how humans have constructed language and our ability to communicate, if we do not acknowledge there is an issue or something that is constantly taking us out of our window of tolerance, we cannot even begin to work on it. So that's the first bit. So for those of you who are listening, you would have probably had some aha moments. Don't let it go away. Stop, pause, write it down. Because in the busyness of life, we can just forget about it and just think, oh, that was a hunch. I talk about downloads when I deliver keynotes and say, when you get a thought and a download, it's a message for you, by you. Do not ignore it, even if it has nothing to do with the content, but it has sparked something you can use. So acknowledging something is a really big part, because then what you can start to do is to see if there's patterns or repeat behaviors or cycles that come about from this thing happening. I know some people, I know that my mum, for instance, and those in her generation, talk about that distressing event. For you to keep talking about it means you keep on re-experiencing it. And I think there's some truth in it if you continue to suffer in it, especially if you're not physically experiencing the pain or discomfort that it brought up. But hiding it, especially if it's running a subconscious narrative in how you show up in the world, is not helpful either. And I'm saying this is the other alternative. So literally acknowledging it is the first step. So I didn't know if you have a question, because I do want to give another one after that.
Yes, no, I meant like stuffing it under the carpet is definitely
Yes.
the way to do it. It's just opening up the carpet and going, what is this? Let's unpack.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. And to that note, I want to share this story. When I talk about that event that happened to me as a child, what I did and continue to do was disassociate. So if something triggered me, I would just mentally remove myself from the dialogue, that it was difficult for me to engage. And I'm talking in relationships. But then when I noticed something with my daughter, she was experiencing some major issues and challenges in school. And I know she doesn't mind me sharing this. And she started to, and this is a trigger warning. And I guess this is where I do need to say this is one of the strategies for anyone who's listening. If you feel the need to leave your body, just tap the side of your palm, or for some people, you can just tap on your collarbone. And I'll talk about tapping in a minute. I started to see signs of self-harm. When I saw that, I disassociated. So people assume that you transfer the exact trauma that you experienced to someone else. No, how you even responded to that traumatic event could actually be how you now respond to the people you love. So that acknowledgement is really powerful. And, and I do courses on this to really break down what that looks like and how we transfer it. So the acknowledgement piece is to not underestimate that even if you just acknowledged it by the end of listening to this conversation, you are well and truly on your way. And then the invitation is to get a little bit more curious. Now, what I have found, in all honesty, that works the most is somatic forms of therapy. And for those who, and I really don't want to overcomplicate it, a lot of it comes from ancient wisdom from around the world. Somatic has a lot to do with your body. Bessel van der Kolk, who, has done so much work on trauma, but really allowed us to have language that those outside of academia, psychology, neuroscience, he's really made it accessible to everyday people. And in his book, The Body Keeps the Score, it doesn't get more rounded than that. Your body has so much wisdom and knowledge. So if you can start to understand your body a bit more, and I know people talk about yoga, but I think we've potentially overly commercialized yoga sometimes, depending on who your instructors are. But if you can really tap into other somatic practices, for me, for instance, it's dancing. There's sometimes the slow dancing, sometimes there's the ecstatic dancing. I'm releasing whatever's in my body. I spoke about tapping, emotional freedom technique, literally, or tapping, like literally just tapping certain points of your body while saying certain words. I found that to be the most powerful, because there was a time I was about to sabotage a business that I had invested over 500,000 in because I didn't think I was worthy, which was also linked back to that event. And the tapping was fundamental because it just allowed me to come back into my body, but it was almost like a reprogramming. And I've also heard that EMDR, cannot remember exactly what that means, what the acronyms mean, but I've heard is a really powerful tool for going back into your memory of what happened to you and changing the narrative.
Wow, that's beautiful. Yes, it's very similar to NLP. So
Yes.
we go back into the story and actually help to rewire our brain to
Mm,
change that story, but in a good way.
yes. Correct.
And so that's beautiful. Thank you so much for the explanation. And how about let's see if we can do this type of work together. I mean, for people
Mm,
that are going through this right now, they've had a traumatic experience, they see the patterns coming up, they see that this is a cycle. Let's
mm,
see if we can even address one of them, one event, perhaps something that we all go through or that we've gone through in the past. That's a sort of a common denominator of trauma that we can
mm,
use this type of somatic work with, even with the tapping. Would we like
mm.
to do that?
Oh, yeah, we can. We absolutely, okay, I love it. Let's get into it. So, do you want to give me an example, or are you wanting me to choose?
Let's go through, let's think about something that makes us feel insignificant,
Mm,
or something that makes us feel not good enough, something that we've gone through. Maybe we've all gone through heartbreak, or we've gone through a breaking up story where we've loved a certain person and then that person has either betrayed us or have walked away on us, and we
mm,
left to feel the effects of that. So the idea of, the insignificance and not
yeah.
worthy, and then you could take that into your life.
Absolutely. Okay, so if I was using tapping for this, let's just put out a fact. So let me create a mini story around that. You were with someone for a very long time. The person's name was Sam, and I'm going to make them genderless, where I've kind of got a gender neutral name. Person's name was Sam, and you really thought this was who you were going to live your life with. And unfortunately, the relationship didn't work out, and Sam cheated. From that experience, very quickly you have created a belief that you're not worthy, you can't be loved, nor can you be in another relationship. So we spoke about how that could actually be built up, that you come into that belief. And the first thing is to acknowledge empathetically to yourself that we understand why you've got that belief, because your experiences, you spent 5 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years with Sam planning a future. Like you put your identity is attached to that. So that's the first thing. We really want to acknowledge that, acknowledge how you came up with that belief, and to not gaslight yourself as to why you did that. A lot of my work is about grace and compassion. In order to do that, and we won't do that here because it would be too much. Sometimes the invitation to the other story, the story you cannot see, is just as powerful in releasing you. But for now, we focus on you and the empathy and the grace and the love you need to give yourself. So we understand why you've come up with that belief and why you now don't think you're worthy. So what we would do, and if you just join me, Laurentine, and doing this anyone else, you're just going to take the palm of, say, your left hand, or whichever is your least dominant hand. You're just going to take the side like you're about to karate chop, and then just use the other hand, the four fingers, and you're just going to tap. And you would start off by saying something, and you just repeat after me, Laurentine. Even though I was with Sam for 10 years.
Even though I was with Sam for 10 years.
And it was a wonderful relationship.
It was a wonderful relationship.
For most of the time.
Most of the time.
And they did cheat on me.
And they did cheat on me.
And it hurt me.
It hurt me.
It broke me.
Broke me.
And I didn't feel worthy.
And I didn't feel worthy.
And I don't feel worthy.
And I don't feel worthy.
So just keep tapping, but I just want to pause and explain, because what you've just heard, as even you repeating after what I just said, you could see how your tone and potential body and energy went down, because we were having to say what it is that we believe to be true. And I know that we have also been taught sometimes not to do that, but we need to let it out. But you're tapping at the same time. And so what continues to happen is where the change happens. But this is a big part. So we ended up with, and I don't feel worthy. And then you take it from tapping there. We're just going to tap kind of like the center of your head. So this is another point. And you say, just repeat after me again. So even though Sam cheated on me.
Even though Sam cheated on me.
And I don't feel worthy as a result of it.
And I don't feel worthy as a result of it.
It's okay.
It's okay.
Because I'm doing the work.
Because I'm doing the work.
And I know there's a way.
I know there's a way.
That I can be worthy again.
That I can be worthy again.
So we're going to stop tapping the top of the head, and we're just going to tap at the top of one of our brows, our eyebrows. I know I don't feel worthy now.
No, I don't feel worthy now.
But I can believe I will feel worthy again.
But I believe I'll feel worthy again.
And although Sam was my everything.
And although Sam was my everything.
I know that I can find love again.
I know that I can find love again.
And so now we're going to tap just underneath one of your eyes, just like under the eye socket. And although I want it to be Sam.
And although I want it to be Sam.
I am open to the possibility of it being somebody else.
I'm open to the possibility of it being someone else.
Because I have loved before.
Because I've loved before.
And I know I can love again.
And I know I can love again.
So if you just stop tapping and just take a deep breath in and out. And another deep breath in and out. Now, usually that would be longer. We'd probably stay with the true feelings of how you feel. And what tends to happen, and because we made this up, is I would guide you as an EFT practitioner to say, if some of the words I'm giving you don't feel right, replace it with something else. This isn't just about the practitioner telling you what to say. The practitioner knows a little bit of the alternative because what I provided while you've been tapping key points, and the way I like to describe it is like acupuncture. They're real functional points in your body that allow you to acknowledge something to get rid of the baggage, but allow you to replace it with other possibilities. For me to know what those other possibilities are is the work I do around liminal thinking, which is who were you before Sam? Who did you become with Sam? And what are the opportunities post Sam? But there's a part of it that really does require you to be fully engaged in the process, even if it's very difficult for you to say what it is. We encourage you to use another word. I found that in particular, EFT, whew, it really allowed me not to sabotage the business I had at the time because I definitely did not think I was worthy of opening up a gym in a different part of the world. And there was something that just changed somatically in my body after I had a few sessions of EFT.
Beautiful. And this is the thing. If we start to associate our whole life with our trauma, then our life can spiral and we have self-sabotage. We
Mhm.
start to repeat these patterns just to show up in these same ways. So if we have just the awareness, like you're
Yeah.
saying, bringing it out, allowing us to talk about it, allowing us to actually feel those emotions, and then using some type of either somatic work or tapping to change the belief system, to really
Yeah.
change the way that we believe in ourselves.
Yes. And it goes back to being kind to yourself because it might take a few tries. It really might. And a few tries for some people might be a few weeks, months, some people years, some people decades. Be kind to yourself because the time will come where you're willing to. And we also have to be careful of a tendency as humans to prove ourselves right, which is, of course, it's not going to work. If you say that, then I promise you, because of how powerful we are as human beings, you will be right. So, my invitation is to say, I believe it's going to work and just roll with it.
I believe it's going to work.
Yeah.
Beautiful. And so if we were going to be taking up the idea of EFT tapping,
Mm.
when would we say to use it? Like when would be the right time to do it? First thing in the morning when the feeling comes up, or how do we train ourselves if we don't
Yeah.
have a practitioner with us?
Oh, look, I mean, I think we've got enough of the world to really telling us to pause and meditate in the morning. So I don't want to take the meditation space. I'd say the most powerful time to do it is when the feeling is really strong. Tapping can be and you can do it yourself. I mean, there are so many teachers on YouTube. The benefit of finding a practitioner is that they can really make it relevant to your specific thing. But I would say when the feeling is really strong, you just go in and you start on the palm and you speak out everything you believe to be true as a belief. And then you start thinking of what could be the alternative stories. What are the other truths? But doing it in the moment really gets you off most of the time that imposter syndrome ladder very quickly. And if you do it in the moment, sometimes I do it before I go on stage. I mean, I don't need it as much anymore, but when I'm nervous and think, who are you to be sharing this story? What makes you think anyone wants to listen to you? I go into the tapping. For some people, it's, when you see someone's leg kind of shaking frantically, if people knew how to listen to their bodies, firstly, what that the body's trying to do is get rid of extra energy and discharge. It's also trying to regulate itself. But because we've been fed, oh, that person's nervous, and there probably is nervousness, the body's so wonderful. It's trying to regulate. See if you can use that to start adding some, words, not necessarily just of affirmation, but alternative words as that happens to regulate you back. And then you go be the badass you know you can be.
Beautiful. That's a really good way to see it. And so how do we deal with triggers then in the future? So we've had this really nice way to handle these
Mm,
emotions that come up, like perhaps during the day or when then you, let's say for the example that we used with Sam. So you're online and you're going through your Facebook feed and all of a sudden you see him with another person, for example.
yeah.
These can either, quite somatically change our moods. It can change
Yeah.
we react to our children, the way that we show up in the world. And so, how do we then continue our life in a
Yeah.
non-triggered way?
Yeah.
Change that.
Well, what if we were to just accept that we will be triggered or activated in life? And that's why I call it cleaning our trauma. People say yes, but it never ends. And then I say, Well, that's why it's continuous. I mean, I don't have the research, and I don't think there's any research out there yet that suggests that it's ever a finished job. And so, what I really suggest to people, especially when I come back to this position of grace, is assume it will be ongoing work, but you will get a lot better and quicker of coming out of it, because most of the time we are triggered because you've come outside your window of tolerance again, or you on the periphery. And the beautiful thing, and I do mean the beautiful thing about some of the triggers, is it gives us an opportunity to find out how much quicker we can get back into our window of tolerance. I still find the tapping really good, because the tapping, not just for, what it might do to the circadian points in your body, it allows you to come back to your body. It allows you to say, oh no, Yemi, you're here. Sam, and that situation with Sam is no longer the situation or the experience you had 5 years ago. It's saying you're here, stay focused here. And what's happening right now here is that you're now with Julie and you're not with Sam anymore. So the tapping is not just about it's actually about physically bringing you back into your body. That is one way, but I do think we must release this notion that we can control everything and it's a hard stop. You just get better at getting back into your window.
Oh, beautiful. And so, with your own experience, let's talk a little bit more about the documentary film and how you were able to bring this message to more people with your TED Talks. What
Mm.
was the premise of this message?
The documentary first, so the first documentary I did, the title really, and still till today, has a lot of people going, huh, why would you even ask that? It's titled Did I Choose My Trauma? And that was about me telling my story, because I was that curious, because I always like to look at things with a decolonizing lens, meaning that there is not just one narrative or a dominant narrative, and that there are some cultures that actually believe that in a past life, because if people do believe in past lives, that you may have chosen to experience something. You didn't choose the event, but you chose to experience what it means to lose your voice and therefore use your voice. I would not be a speaker, I don't believe, had I not experienced that. However, I don't think people should have to experience that in order to find their voice. And that becomes the work and the offering. Is if you went through this, you experienced it, is there anything we can do to tweak that experience so that others either don't have to go through what you went through, or others don't have to experience or be the perpetrators of other people's pain? So it's quite multi-layered, and I'm pretty confident this work is going to take me up until my last breath on earth. But I hope there's enough information to give to other people to be able to continue the work. But a big part of my documentaries and my TED Talk is I want you to acknowledge what you went through. And then I want you to really get curious about what it looks like to awaken. Another form could be cleanse or clean your trauma. And then if you really can, because humanity needs this, how can you contribute back in spite of what happened to you?
That is beautiful. Talk a little bit more about this work of how you can use your trauma as a
Mm.
way to actually help and benefit others.
So an example would be this, me talking to you. And I don't want to suggest everybody needs to do this, because this feels quite large and big scale. And it continues to take a lot of shame resilience for me to be able to share that. And it's taken a couple of years to, share other things. Another thing that I definitely think impacted me was I have two kids with two different dads. My goodness, I couldn't have said it with this level of calmness 4 years ago. I would have given you a whole introduction as to why and blah, blah. And so, you know, one way you can do it is building, and it doesn't always have to be shame, but shame is a big theme that's coming up in my research on trauma, full stop, but also cultural trauma, is building shame resilience to get to a position to speak about either what you experienced. So it could be, whether if you were a refugee, some people want to keep that story to themselves. And absolutely, you do whatever it is that makes you feel safe psychologically and physically. But there are some people who feel strong enough to speak about it. They don't have to go on stage, but they can influence policies. They can also go into communities to explain the reason why helping refugees, and it's not even just a case of helping, but just helping anybody is an alternative to a lot of people questioning why politicians, make such moves. So It's actually thinking, but I have to please make this very clear. It's really important that people do the work on themselves before they start to share how they can contribute to other people. Because without it, we are operating from an unhealed version of our trauma. And this is where we can transfer as opposed to transform. But once you start to clean or cleanse your own trauma, how you can offer this back to people becomes really obvious.
And beautiful. And can we talk a little bit about, for example, people that have gone through abuse, people that have gone through any type of sexual or emotional or physical abuse, and then being able to still, like we talked about triggers, being able to still have a normal functioning life with those people around us. So, for example, having to still see the abuser, or having to still, for example, if you've been in a very difficult relationship, but you have children with that person, and you still need to see that human being, and you have to try and make peace within yourself. How do you go forward, either with forgiveness or with belief systems, or tapping in this respect?
This is a tough one because, and if people go and watch my first documentary, I do think there is a part that explains that, or might be the second documentary, that forgiveness isn't expected of everybody. There are some people who don't believe forgiveness is the way. I think differently. I think forgiveness for me was more about me releasing myself. To see your abuser often or regularly or even every now and again is tough. You'd have to do a lot of real work. However, I do have to say that millions around the world probably face their abusers, but in a non-traditional sense. And I probably put this more to cultural trauma and the whole gender conversation, the whole identity conversations. Whether we know it or not, we are already doing it in some capacity. It's just not as insular and direct as, say, abuse of either sexual abuse or domestic violence or financial abuse. So I guess I want to highlight that from the macro, but bring it back to the micro of those who have those very closer proximity ones. I want to acknowledge that you probably would need to make a decision as to whether being in the same geographical space is good enough for you, because psychological homelessness is a thing. And it can be a thing even when you are in your own environment. And one thing that has come up from my research so far is that in order for a lot of people to be able to even transform their trauma, they have had to leave either the site of trauma geographically or mentally in some capacity, which potentially could mean that you're kind of leaving your body, but a lot of them have had to geographically leave the space. Now, I don't think everyone needs to do that. I don't think I've come through enough research to understand how people can live closely with abusers. But I would say a decision does need to be made, and if it's safe psychologically to do that. When it comes to relationships with other people, I think it's back to grace again. You know, Laurentine, I wanted to say Laurentine, I must think there's something flowery about you. I love it. Um, I do want to, I do want to mention that the stats say 70% minimum of adults have experienced a distressing event. That was pre-2020. That means for every two people standing, there's at least one who's experienced it. Meaning if there's a room of 10 people, 7 have experienced it. We cannot be isolated in the traumas we have experienced because other people have experienced trauma. So in order for you to relate to anybody else, relationship-wise, will require you to leave some space in your mind, in your heart, in your rage, in your sorrow, in your grief for somebody else who has most likely experienced something similar or different that has had a big impact. That really becomes the work for us as humans, because we are potentially all going to roam the earth like the walking dead because we have not made space for anyone else to have pain.
Beautifully said, beautifully said. Thank you. But I see a lot of women, especially, going back into abusive relationships and going back into, I guess, more of the abuser and the trauma bond experience, and they can't physically even move away from that because they feel that need to keep coming back. What exactly is that, and how do you break that cycle?
It's a great question. And I guess not coincidentally, I sit on the advisory council for White Ribbon Australia, which is all about, domestic violence. I think I may have understood in the past, but now even understand and empathize more as to how hard it is for predominantly women to leave the spaces of domestic violence without knowing what it looks like for them to actually break that cycle. One thing I do want to say is that society needs to help more. So when I sit and I talk about some of my pain points, which is racism in Australia, I am desperately asking allies to make themselves known. I believe it's the same for domestic violence. If men typically are the ones that choose violence over women, we are asking men to come into the conversation. So it is extremely difficult, especially when we think, oh, yeah, I get, it's not even emotional. I get really troubled when I have to try to explain this. The centuries of inequities on the power that men hold over women. You're asking women predominantly in these spaces to challenge century old paradigms of men having power and either using violence or money over them. That's what we're asking. And it's tough. And so I believe in order for that cycle to be broken, society, men need to step into the conversation. And I've sat with White Ribbon before, and I probably haven't voiced it properly because I really do want to focus on deep listening, which is a term Daddy and from the First Nations people here in Australia, is for us to also accept our truths, no matter what country you're in. There is going to be a story of colonialism. Domestic violence and abuse comes from a blueprint. Let's not hide in shame. It is part of our collective history, people sitting on different ends on it. So this concept of domestic violence has not come from thin air. It comes from a blueprint and has graduated into other stuff and continuously perpetuated. So where we sit here and think it's the women, especially alone, who can break out of that cycle, firstly, they need to know that wherever they're going to will hold them. We need to know that the judicial system will protect them. But we also need to know that the men mainly who are using this as violence, the space is created for them to reform.
Beautiful. So there should be a discussion or a dialogue, at least for men around this, so that other
Yep.
men help support each other and
Yes.
actually see that this is not okay. This
Yeah.
is okay. I mean, especially now we're coming in a really enlightened time of our
Yes.
time, and we as women need to hold space for each other, yes,
Yes. Yes.
but we also need to hold these men accountable for these actions and say, no, it's not okay anymore. And find ways for them to be able to get support and healing through either a support network or other examples where this is not okay.
Yeah. And that last bit you said is something that I really want to echo more. Yes, there should be repercussions and need to be held responsible, but we also have to create something that doesn't put them back in the system. And it's tough. It's tough because we have most of us have grown up in this binary world as you're either for the people who are being abused or the people who are using violence. There's got to be a way for us to be able to do something for both, always attending to the people who need help the most.
Beautiful, beautifully said. So, Yemi, we've got some rapid fire questions for you, and I'm going to be questioning you, and you're just going to be just answering them as best you can, just whatever comes to mind for you, okay?
Okay.
What is your go-to breakfast or meal in the morning?
Oof. So at the moment, I toggle between a green smoothie, which consists of spinach, pineapple, and green apple, or I go for a 3 egg omelette with spinach, onions, and a little bit of feta cheese.
Beautiful. And what is your favorite supplement?
Oh, I'm not a big fan of supplements, but at the moment, I have no choice, believe it or not, to take vitamin D supplements to really just help with everything, skin, hair, because as I go into my 40s, things are changing perimenopausal.
What is your guilty pleasure?
Oh, my guilty pleasure is silence. I wear a badge at home that says silence so that nobody talks to me sometimes. But that is my guilty pleasure, plus sweet and salt popcorn.
What is your turn to lifestyle practice?
Oh, oh, it's retreats. I retreat. It doesn't have to be like a highly funded, it could literally be going back to the home of my fiance and I by the lake and just convening with trees and the lake and the ocean. Retreating every couple of months is mandatory for my life force.
And what's your go-to food as medicine?
Ooh, soul food, it would have to be a Nigerian dish, which is called pounded yam. And we have it with egusi soup, which just has like spices and spinach and yeah, soul food that just speaks the language.
That's it.
Oh, that was fun.
Okay, so thank you so much, Yemi, for this discussion on lots of different topics. We covered so much from trauma to healing to EFT to tapping to using documentary films as a medium. And thank you so much for sharing your story as well. And I know it's vulnerable, especially because we live in a country where we'd like to say we are very open to lots of genders, but it is sometimes quite sad to hear all the cases of racism that are happening still today. But thank you so much, Yemi. Thank you for your time. If there's anything you'd like to share with the Food Matters community, your last words and wisdom, please feel free to share it now.
I'd love to connect with community. I'm all about community. Do follow me on Instagram, say hi, share any aha moments. But most of all, know that you matter. And I want to say thank you so much for having me on the show.
So yes, thank you everyone for listening. I really enjoyed that talk. I hope you did too. And there will be more of these on the Food Matters podcast. So head to foodmatters.com and see you again.